Welcome to Rejected Religion Patreon, Tier 3, The Garden of Arcane Delights. My guests today are Dr. Cavan McLaughlin and Dr. Sarah Perez. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
I'm so happy that you both are here today. This is a discussion that I have wanted to have since the last ESSWE conference back in 2023. Time flies. In the session Creativity and Occultural Production I attended, both Cavan and Sarah presented some very interesting papers. And at that conference, I also presented on another day about my research regarding Tulpas and Otherkin. And as Cavan and Sarah's topics were kind of in this general area as well, I thought to myself back then how wonderful it would be if we could get together and talk about all of this in more detail. So I'm very happy to welcome you both here.
Thank you very much.
Very happy to be here.
Good. I'm so happy. Let's jump into this. What I had in mind was that we could kind of take turns sharing our own research. And I'm happy to start if that's okay with you guys. After we share something, we can just jump in and add, questions, commentary, whatever. And then we can kind of, after we have all discussed our things, then we can kind of make some preliminary conclusions or look at the bigger picture and that type of thing. So are you good with that?
Perfect.
Yeah, absolutely.
As for myself, I haven't really talked a lot about my research on this platform. Every once in a while, I'll mention something about it, but I haven't really gotten specifically an episode about this, so I'm happy to be able to do that today. I guess in short, during my studies, I researched a subculture known as Otherkin. Otherkin are people who, while they fully realize that they live their lives in a human body, they identify as something other than human. And this identity can be basically anything. It can be animals, plants, machines, AI, alien, mythical objects. What matters is that there is a sentience of some kind. And just to mention here, animism plays a large role for many Otherkin who perhaps identify as machines or plants or things like that. So because this idea that everything has sentience or soul even. Because I can kind of imagine that some of the listeners might be scratching their head thinking, objects, plants, machines, how can this be? So there's the idea that there's some type of consciousness there. And that will come back into the discussion later on. So I basically started my research into Otherkin at the end of my bachelor degree and then went through into my research master. So I've been studying this for a little while. And I've noticed that over time that many Otherkin also speak of having other entities or people, so to speak, residing in their mind or in their headspace. And the terms that they would use were terms like headmates, tulpas, thought forms, walk-ins, and of course within esoteric studies, thought forms, tulpas, walk-ins, these are already familiar terms for me. So I was very intrigued and I wanted to know more about what this was all about. And I didn't have the time to go into all of this while I was writing my research master thesis about Otherkin, so this kind of got put to the side. And for the ESSWE conference, I decided to do a short study and ask some of the people that I had worked with before if they'd be willing to take part in this questionnaire that I had drawn up to ask more questions about tulpas or other than human entities in that sense. So I guess I'll just jump into the data that I have. The phenomenon of experiencing more than one person or entity in a mind is called plurality in this community. They use this word. This is the general term. People who experience this generally call themselves plural systems. And plurality is actually an umbrella term in this context. Alternately, we can see plurality as a spectrum with naturally forming systems that are not trauma-based on one end, and then traumagenic or trauma-based systems on the other end of the spectrum. They describe plurality as either being innate or it can naturally develop over time, similar to how Otherkin view themselves as having no choice in the matter. It's just how they're born. Or it can be intentionally created, as seen in the tulpamancy community online, where the creation of tulpas is a choice. So Let's see. I'll just stick to the data that I gathered from the plural systems and not get into any theories or methods at this point. So let me go through my notes here. Plural systems say in their own words that they view themselves as multiple independent parts or facets all residing together, or a collection of people in one mind. All participants agreed that a person can choose to become part of a plural system, but not all agreed in this study that I did with 10 people. Not all agreed that a person can be born as a plural system. One disagreed entirely. One said that it was only possible in a spiritual sense as opposed to psychologically. And the rest, the other 8, said it was possible regardless of spiritual beliefs. Names for the people in the system also vary depending on how the system originated. Some innate or naturally forming systems use the terms cismate, entity, tulpa, or thought forms. Some traumagenic systems use the terms alter, part, facet, or personalities, but the most common term used seems to be headmate. So that's what I saw most often in my previous interactions with the Otherkin, that they would talk about these headmates, and that's what got me started to ask, well, what are you talking about headmates? What do you mean by that? So with regard to tulpas in particular, these are seen by many as a special sort of thought form, and there is a community of tulpamancers, as I mentioned, who focus on this type. Tulpas are most often willingly created, although the possibility of spontaneous or unintentional tulpas also exists. When asked how tulpas are created, the most frequent answer was an intense and sustained exercise of the imagination, where attention is given to the tulpa, talking to them until they talk back over time. However, of course, there's always an exception. Unintentional tulpas, known as walk-ins, can come to exist as a result of unconscious activity. Talking about the imagination as a tool of perception, many plural systems talk about their headmates residing altogether in what they call inner world or wonderland or their headspace or mindscape. There are different terms that they use for that. But they note, they're adamant about this, that their inner world is just as real as the external physical world. And most of the participants that I interacted with for this short study, they noted these aspects, and the systems agreed that detail varies from system to system depending on the imaginative skills. Because what I learned is that some participants, they have a explanation for this. Aphantasia, the inability to visualize or form mental images of objects that are not present. So in this case, participants spoke of what they call the void, where interaction with system members was possible by hearing or feeling a presence. And then some of the participants said that they've heard, they didn't experience this themselves, but they had heard that other systems do not have an inner world at all. So you have a range of options, I guess. But whatever is happening within the system, what they wanted to stress was that this was very real to them, and it was as real as the external world is. And lastly, I think I'll just touch on the aspect of challenges that the participants had noted when I asked them if there were any misconceptions that the larger mainstream public had about them. And some of the frustrations were listed as follows. Plurality has been medicalized, where the focus is primarily on medical disorders that some plural systems deal with. Plurality is not always a disorder and does not inherently cause dysfunction or distress. There are different ways to be plural. These systems are real, quote unquote, real to them. Plural systems are not broken people who need fixing. And then when asked about specific misconceptions that they hear when they get like feedback from other people, if they talk about this, usually they get told that they're crazy or schizophrenic, and crazy is just in quotation marks, that they are dangerous, evil, or potential criminals, that there is only one real self and that their alters are just like this one example that was given to me I thought was interesting, that the alters are just like backup singers and that they're not autonomous in their own right. I thought that was interesting. That they are always disordered or psychotic, and that it's a product of an out-of-control fantasy or that they are faking it. So that basically is the data that I got from this several-month study that I did with these research participants. And while I know that Cavan has an interest in other areas that I also touched upon in this study, I'll leave that for later when we talk about that, when we talk about imagination and the overlap with other than human entities and neurodivergence and stuff, but we'll come back around that to the end. Right now, I just wanted to know if anyone wanted to jump in and add anything at this point.
Yeah, many of the things, I made a little bit of notes with key terms that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And many of the things that you mentioned, I see them also discussed or part of the reality shifting community. Okay. So, of course, imagination practices then this idea of it's just as real as in my case, the current reality. And then especially, and I find that super important to talk about, are these challenges and misconceptions and frustrations about these kind of parasocial relationships that they have to the people in their desired reality. And I don't know how it was for you when you did research with them, but for me, that as a researcher also was a big challenge because they are, of course, aware of the publications and of these misconceptions, and they are not shy confronting us with these misconceptions. And I had also shifters. So I did my interviews in 22, and in 21, one of the most popular articles came out, and they reacted strongly to this article. And many of them said to me, I can talk to you, but first tell me your opinion on this article. Some of them also took their interviews back and said, now I read this other article, I don't want to speak to you anymore. Because exactly this idea of them being psychotic or having this out of control fantasy, what you called it. And I think this is a super important topic.
Agree. Cavan.
Yeah, okay, so maybe I'll follow up on that.
Okay.
I mean, the danger here is that there's almost too much that I'd like to say, so I'll hone in.
Okay.
I'll hone in on that specific aspect. As you know, I have a particular interest in tulpamancy, but I have that interest because of a much broader interest in alienated agency in general and all of those kind of relationalities with the other than human. And, you know, we can go into that where that's pertinent. But the reason that I'm massively interested in tulpamancy is that within sort of esotericism, there's many relationships or ways of engaging with other entities and other agencies that are considered esoteric. They're definitively very, very other. They're demons, angels, you know, whereas within tulpamancy, what's deeply fascinating about the community is how hard they're pushing for the normalization of this process, that this is actually a very everyday thing within the capacity of a normal, healthy, absolutely not pathological human mind. And I think that's the really, really, really important point. And I'll add a second point to that. It's important to me personally as well, because in my work with regards entity encounters, alienated agency, all these things, I'm an ethnographer and I'm very open about being a practicing magician. So my interest in these things is raised by the fact that I have had encounters with seemingly alienated agents, right? I've had voices in my head, purposefully created, you know, whether these are different things we talk about in esotericism, about knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel, or engaging with all kinds of different, right? So it's not tulpamancy per se, but I became very fascinated, particularly with the work of Eiler from the tulpamancy community and their work with Tanya Lerman and how they connected the processes that were involved in creating a tulpa with the same processes involved in having a personification of God.
Yeah.
And so me, as someone who's a transdisciplinarian, I'm seeing all of these things interweaving and being completely fascinated by them. But I've always shamelessly talked to people about my experiences because I believe that's transparency is absolutely important. And also it helps push away concerns around pathologizing and stuff like that. But what I want to say is from the very start, me talking about having had experiences of voices, entities, alienated agency and stuff like that, triggered reactions of, don't talk about that, you shouldn't talk about that, people will think you're mad, people will think either this is a problem, it'll destroy your credibility, etc., etc., etc. So this is an area that I'm massively interested in because when I think about these phenomena, and I think about the extent to which we pathologize them and the extent to which people are quite scared about them, particularly within a Western context. And yet, on my other hand, when I was in my classes as an artist teaching creativity, and we were talking about the autonomy of the creative process and people's experience of alienated agency within the creative process, I have yet to encounter a human who has not had this sense of alienated agency within their interiority. So it's bizarre to me, frankly, that it's that this fear and this concern and this really negative approach that people can take to what tulpamancers and other such are doing, and indeed Otherkin, just this sense of one's identity and feeling like it's other, like you feel like an alien in this world. You have a way of constructing your own identity, your sense of self around that sense of estrangement and alienation with regards to your everyday lived experience. So those are the things for me that are of real interest. And they're really interesting because of my sort of cultural studies background and my concerns about power and agency and how this all interrelates.
Right. Very good points there. Sarah, did you want to add anything else before you get into your reality shifting?
Yeah, maybe one more general thing. As many of these groups, they also meet online and discuss things online. We have shortly talked about TikTok and all these platforms, Reddit, YouTube. And I think from a research ethics side, it's also super important to be careful talking to these people and taking them seriously because, of course, in the internet, this public and private spheres, they're really difficult to keep apart. And especially in groups like Reddit or Amino or TikTok, where they also have usernames, we might not always know who's behind it. We don't know much of these people. We don't know how old or young they are. We don't know the challenges they experience. And so specifically in this public-private mess of the internet, I think from a research ethics side, is we need to really be careful.
I agree. Yeah, I should make note of this here. With the study that I did ask for signatures, in digital form, on that they would sign forms that they are over 18 years old. Of course, you can run into anybody on the internet. You don't know. But for me, it was very important that everyone would consent that, yes, I am an adult, because, yeah, you don't want to get into to that area of talking to young people who could be quite vulnerable, and you don't want to make any type of misuse of the trust that you're trying to build up in, when you're working as a researcher.
Can I just add an addendum to that?
Sure.
Because that's a hugely important point. In fact, there might not be a more important point than the ethical concerns around this.
Yeah.
And I want to just extend that to one thing I've always talked about, particularly initially came out of my interest in tulpamancy, is Vessier's article, the Varieties of Tulpa article. That point at the end of that article where the research board had considered the ethical concerns of the tulpa on the basis that maybe they have autonomy, or what are the ethical concerns. I always bring that up in my talks, and I relate this to people because of course we should be thinking about the ethical concerns of the other human agents that we're engaging in this process. But actually this broader question about ethical concerns with our engagement with other than human agency is not talked about enough, and in fact is being talked about more through things like new materialism, panpsychism, even just concerns about the non-human animals as an other than human agency and stuff. So I think this core concern of ethics with regards to relationality is another thing that's really tied up in this phenomena. That's something that far more research and focus needs to be put into.
Agree. So, Sarah, your presentation focused on something known as, I mentioned it before, reality shifting. And while I didn't have a lot of background knowledge about this, I found your presentation to be super interesting because I saw a lot of related or overlapping things going on with what you were looking into. So could you share more about that?
Yeah, of course. That was really an amazing conference for me. You said I was 23, right?
Yeah.
So that was the first time I really presented on reality shifting, and it was received very well. So it's nice to come back to it. So reality shifting is a quite popular spiritual practice centered around the wish to shift one's consciousness to other realities. And it became very popular online in the late 2020s, and it's also practiced mostly by persons falling under the demographic of Gen Z, so they are mostly young adults right now. And generally, reality shifting, or the shifters, they practice a wide range of methods involving affirmations, visualizations, imagination, and with that they try to project their consciousness into other, and they're often fiction-based realities. So there's no consensus, and generally it's a very dynamic group. So many things that I looked at in 21, 22, 23, and 24 have now changed very much. So not really a consensus, but the majority of the shifting communities, and there's different ones, seem to adhere to a kind of a multiverse perspective. And from this perspective, the reality that we inhabit as humans, it would be the current reality. But there's infinite realities. And so with specific techniques, you can choose a target reality that would then be the so-called desired reality. There are also different names for that. And what I found interesting in my talks with the practitioners, because I did interviews with them, is that these realities, they can differ immensely. So, for example, them wanting to be in an avatar universe and then therefore also being these avatar characters, but they can also differ in very only small regards. I had a person who talked about that them as a Black person, it's difficult for them in living in America to attend a university. And so for them, their desired reality was just a world that is very similar to ours, but without racism. I talked to a transgender person. She was in the progress of transitioning, and she said her reality, desired reality, was also very similar to the current reality, but she could get pregnant and start a family. Other than that, nothing else was different. So yeah, that's, I think, the short explanation.
Okay. I can't remember what it was. I asked you a question back at the conference, but because it was so long ago now, I don't remember exactly what I asked you. I think it had something to do with where is, for the reality shifters, how do they view this other place? Do they feel that their consciousness and everything goes to that place? Do they believe that the physical body stays behind, or do they think that they're actually shifting body and consciousness into this other place, dimension? How is that working in the mind for these people?
Yeah, so there's many theories, and this one is this: really there are infinite realities, and there is a different reality self of each person. So we exist in all these realities, and therefore really our consciousness, it only switches to this other reality self. And then you still exist in this current reality then, and you do your everyday life. No one would notice any difference. And then there's also the consciousness theory, which is the biggest rival theory to the first one. And this one would then be that you change your surrounding into the other reality. So you don't shift, but you basically create. So these are the most popular theories at the moment.
Right.
But it changes quickly.
I see.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, and of course, I remember at that conference being blown away by that particular paper, not least of all because I hadn't heard of reality shifting, and then you laid it all out to me as the sort of phenomenon in a generation that I wasn't born to. And you ended up describing a way of conceptualizing exactly what I do in my magical practice. And so I actually went from that. The name of my PhD even changed. So I have to both thank you and chastise you for making me have to go away and reconceptualize all of my research. So I went and gave a talk at Occulture conference soon after that called An Account of Reality Shifting Magic and the Application of Many World Ontologies, because of what you said and me going back and rethinking my entire understanding of this. So thank you for that. And as you said, it's linked with tulpamancy in terms of it's this plurality. It's this pluralizing and this way of conceptualizing, being able to shift between whether it's plural systems, sort of altars within the interiority sense, or whether it's possible worlds, which is how I conceptualize it. Because I think it's very interesting to take it outside of just multiverse theory and include all possible worlds, virtual worlds, speculative fictions, and all of these things. And all of a sudden, we've got an incredibly good model of understanding the world and how people navigate it in these ways that are explicitly kind of occultural and even just in terms of creative writing and fiction and so many things, dream and yeah. So as I said, both thank you, and also I had to throw out most of my PhD and rewrite it based on that. So.
But maybe I can also quickly thank you, because I remember you had the first question after my talk. And I said to Stephanie already, I was super nervous because I hadn't presented on it yet. And I had also gotten a little bit of a more negative feedback, like, oh, it's just a trend, don't waste your time on it. So I was super nervous. And then you had the first question and you were so enthusiastic about it. And that really set the mood for all the other questions coming then. I mean, Stephanie, you were there, and that was very, very nice for me to get this kind of feedback. Yeah.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Cavan, I'm now curious, what was the major shift that you had to make then in your dissertation? Where was the sticking point then for you that you had to make this complete shift, a reality shift?
So where it took me was I was very focused on the kind of understanding all of the ways that I was seeing things from a kind of semiotic language position, sort of everything's language. And that was my way of kind of conceptualizing and moving through it. So ideas around revision and around being able to narrative identity and creating narratives, all these things was where my main focus was. And of course, occulture being a kind of discursive field, this all made total sense to me. But then when we think about this idea of reality shifting and maybe actually shifting between worlds, or this is a different way of conceptualizing of magic, because instead of something materializing in front of you, the idea is that you're shifting to the reality where that's there. And all of a sudden, this idea of both the kind of materiality of it in terms of what one encounters, but also the process in itself, which is this translocation between possible worlds. I immediately saw a connection between that and the sort of concept of worlding that's come out of feminist new materialism and this kind of co-creation of the world in our kind of interrelationship in its becoming. I also noticed then that there was a trajectory within occultural theory towards the post-humanities and towards new materialism, and that kind of made me sort of reconceptualize outside of just a kind of discursive semiotic framework into a material discursive framework, and sort of seeing that that's how these two things, that's how we get the bleed between the kind of the conceptual and the material, is because I'm very much along with the new materialists in this kind of dual aspect kind of way of conceptualizing things.
For the listener, could you give a little brief description of what new materialism is about?
Well, I mean, there are many new materialisms.
Okay. Which one are you using?
Well, I'm particularly influenced by Donna Haraway.
Okay, yeah.
And Karen Barad.
Yeah, okay.
So Haraway was a lot of where I, initially sort of came across this concept of worlding, and this sense of becoming in relation with other things. And so I found that incredibly valuable. And there was a lot to do in her work with regards all the way back to her famous article, Situated Knowledges, where she starts to draw together the interrelationships between kind of the semiotic and the matter, about things mattering and kind of different ways of conceptualizing that and sort of interplay between those. And I had just been so caught up in a linguistic framework that I hadn't made this leap. This is what we have. It's materialism, but it's not a materialism wherein we're focused only on the material world with a categorical separation away from the mental world or the immaterial world in sort of different ways that can be conceptualized by different folks. It's sort of bringing these two things back together and saying it varies, but different aspects either of an underlying monistic kind of layer or as sort of two aspects of the same thing. And this is hugely valuable, I think, because it's been really valuable in terms of sort of reconceptualizing the world in terms of a relationscape and a net or network with like all other things, be they physical or psychic, material and mental, sort of dealing with the problem sort of created by Cartesian dualism and other forms of dualism, which sort of see those worlds as entirely disconnected and not being able to understand how they interact with each other. It's sort of a philosophical position that makes it very clear that they interact with each other because they're in direct relation.
Right.
They are connected.
Yeah. I don't know if you would agree with me or not, where I was looking at this whole thing, because the word imagination kept coming up in the dialogue, that you had to use this imagination to be able to create this inner space, this, this place where actually one of the participants, the plural system, they created a three-dimensional space within the mind that appears as a separate world with a vast and diverse landscape, as they said. It includes bodies of water, a forest, a coral reef, clearings, meadows, different homes where each member lives. So this is a place where they go. This is actual, it might not be material as we understand material as a chair or a desk, but for them, it's just as real as what we're seeing right now in this space where we're interacting with each other now.
Yeah.
And I began to wonder whether or not Henri Corbin's concept that he took from Sufi teachings about the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal, and then how James Hillman, the psychologist, took upon that concept of the mundus imaginalis and then started to operate on the premise that everything we know, feel, and say is imagination-based. So everything that we feel, that we observe, comes from a psychic event first forming as an image in our mind. That's what, basically what Hillman was talking about. So I don't know, what do you think about that? That this provides the base for our consciousness. What do you think?
Well, it may do, and it certainly provides the basis for our engagement.
Yeah.
With whatever, right. So there may be some kind of objective reality out there, right? I'm one of the very many people that suspects that's very likely the case. But what we actually engage in every day, if we look at sort of consciousness studies and neuroscience and stuff, is we're living in a hallucination that we're creating. The thing that we project out of us as our external world that we're living in is in fact a hallucination that our mind is creating.
Yeah. And
so, we've always had that. That's the hard problem of consciousness. We've always had difficulty around knowing, this is why it's a philosophical position, right? Whether there's a direct interplay or not and what the mechanism is. But the point is, we are existing within a mindscape that we're creating in our minds. And of course, you're making a categorical difference between the actual physical world and a location within your mindscape that is virtual in some sense. And that is a useful categorical distinction. But is there a disconnect? Maybe not. And therefore, is there interplay and movement between them? Very likely.
Yeah, what came to my mind, and I can only talk about, of course, what I hear the shifters talking about. And that reminds me really heavily of this mind over matter attitude that the shifters have. And what's interesting is the so-called mini shifts here. These can be either super short shifts that are maybe unintentional, or shifts that are where the difference to the reality is super small. So one shifter talked about having a moment where they were blinking And every time they were blinking, there was a different reality, and they didn't even try this. So these kinds of mini shifts remind me of what we just discussed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this has a relationship as well with phenomena like the Mandela effect, or just this sense, the sense that people have that, like, wait a minute,
that wasn't that way before.
That wasn't that way before, right? And most people explain this away as it must be a misremembering or a misinterpretation. But another possible explanation is that it wasn't previously like that. That is a possible explanation that we can't discount necessarily.
Yeah, this gets into so many different, you can go off on all these little tangents about all these different possibilities that are potentialities that are coming up as we keep talking about this. Cavan, you said in a prior correspondence that you were interested in groups that identify as other than human and the overlap with neurodivergence. And this is what I was kind of referring to before at the beginning when we started out. And I'd like you to unpack this a little bit more. And of course, if there are any other points or observations that you'd like to add, please feel free to do so. But you asked that before about the neurodivergency, and there's something that I could share about that as well. So please, you have the floor.
Yeah, well, it's just been an observation, both in my studies of these communities and individuals more broadly, and in my study of myself as a neurodivergent. Fairly recently discovered, apparently only by me, everyone else already knew. But I certainly noticed in the tulpamancy community that there was very high numbers on people that either self-diagnosed or were diagnosed, and then also discussions around to what extent the sort of plural system phenomena was a type of neurodiversity in and of itself. So this was interesting to me. It was interesting with regards to my own personal experience. And then I also just had realized that there were sort of inflated numbers of neurodivergence in other kind of in occult communities and in gaming communities and in queer communities and in trans communities. And this just seems a really obvious and interesting thread, this connection. And I wonder about that, and I wonder about to what extent it has something to do with the fact that when you're born into a world as a neurodivergent person, that some of your earliest ways of relating to the world is a sense of alienation, because it is a world that you don't seem to be from. You feel alienated as a very natural consequence of it being a world that's not built for built often by neurodivergent people, but for neurotypical people. That's in fact the world that we live in. And so, yeah, I'd come across this, I'd seen this relationship everywhere else, and then I put that to you, and you were like, that tracks. This is true in Otherkin communities as well, which comes as absolutely no surprise.
No, not at all.
Also, again, reality shifting fits very well too. So I have only talked with a few communities, not with all, but I definitely, the one that I talked to, there was a very inclusive community, and they created different methods for neurodivergent participants. So they would say, hey, I have this and that. I'm struggling with this kind of the method or these parts of the method. And then the group comes together to try and figure out a method that maybe fits better. And then they report also back, hey, I have tried this and that really helped for me. And they really discuss these issues among each other.
And do you know, like, in terms of the numbers, it's very hard to say because the numbers are colossal for reality shifting. So it's hard to say whether there's different number of people interested in reality shifting that are neurodivergent compared to the rest of the population.
So I have access to one internal survey that I haven't created it. It was just given to me. And there were, I think, around 600 people that participated. But there's no question on that, sadly. I mean, that would be amazing. And they're generally quite open in participating in such surveys. So maybe that would be interesting.
I think it's probably a larger amount than what we can know, because I've asked this question before about, how many Otherkin are there in the world? And, from within the community, some of the what they call the elders in the community, that have been around for the longest. They say, well, you can do a study that says, oh, there might be 10,000 in this country and maybe, I don't know, 2,000 in another. But how often does it happen that these people are not talking about this and not participating in a survey or a study, and these voices go unheard? And also with I don't know how it is for reality shifting, but for Otherkin, it's oftentimes a lot of secrecy around that, and they don't just open up to everybody who comes in asking, "Hey, are you an Otherkin? Do you identify as something other than human?" Because of a lot of problems that they had experienced. Especially, it seemed to be, I don't know if that's shifting now. I'm using that word funny enough. If that's changing now, if there's a paradigm shift happening, because it seems to be that the intersections between neurodivergence, plurality, gender, and otherkinity, when I asked these specific questions, there was a resounding yes. Yes, there are a lot of transgender people. It's not uncommon for a plural system to have headmates of different genders. That they're always talking about the overlap. Also with autism, that there seems to be a link there with autistic people not relating to their assigned gender at birth. So it's not just one thing. It seems like it's all these different things that are happening. And I wonder if there might be some kind of shift happening, a paradigm shift as the way people are thinking about it. Because the people that I spoke to, the Otherkin that I spoke to in the past said, maybe 10, 15 years ago, you had to be really careful about who you told about this kind of thing because there was a lot of harassment and bullying going on. And I don't know if you've heard anything, either one of you have heard anything about that, if you've noticed that people are becoming a little bit more open to the possibility.
What's interesting here is I talked already about reality shifting is practiced by a big number. It's young adults. It's this Gen Z generation. And there is definitely a big awareness for these topics. And so there, I didn't have much difficulty talking to them about it. And without me even bringing the topic up by myself, they did want to talk about it because it had such an effect also on how they wanted to experience their shift and their desired reality. Right. It had such a big effect on the methods that work for them. So that's how we talked about it, and they were quite open.
Right. Cavan?
Yeah, similarly, and what I would note is I think it has a relationship with just the large shift we're seeing in society in general with regards to it being safer for people to have these kind of discussions about queer identity, about neurodiversity, and kind of all different forms of diversity. And one thing that I was going to bring up actually was that, again, when we see this in the occult communities, again, where, as I say, we see a high number of people that are sort of queer, have all sorts of different gender orientation and neurodivergence as well. Although not necessarily many of them would consider themselves situated within the Otherkin community, loads of them have talked for a very long time about their own identity as being other than human. Right? And not very openly before, but people would talk about having a sense that they are not actually human, but maybe like fae or a fallen angel or all of these different things. And so this is actually really commonplace. And what I've noticed is a shift in people being more comfortable talking about that, which was very much more, in my experience, anecdotally, but quite extensive experience, a bit more of a closed door conversation. It's becoming safer and more common for people to have these discussions more openly.
Good. I see that as a positive development then, because Otherkin have been around for as long as people can think about, their identity. So that's something that I learned throughout my research. This is a very old idea. It's just it has different iterations, I guess you could say, and different ways of understanding it.
Well, I was just going to say as well, there's another thread that's deeply fascinating for me that through so many of these things, as well as this sort of link we said to neurodiversity and these kinds of things, is the association, particularly with tulpamancy and reality shifting, which are two things I know about. I know less about Otherkin, but I'm going to go ahead and bet that there's a link here again, is this association with fandom. Like, because with Tulpamancy coming out of My Little Pony, and when I looked into reality shifting and its relationship, particularly with Harry Potter universe, there's like a huge number of people that there seemed to be a relationship with people wanting to reality shift into different worlds with relationship to fandom.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing Otherkin, people are relating it to a lot of these things are based in fictional works initially. So sometimes people are clearly identifying as having come from different places that have a relationship with the fandom of those worlds, right? Tolkien elves and these kinds of.
Exactly, yeah. And there is a category within Otherkin, the umbrella of Otherkin, of fiction-based Otherkin. So that can also be combined with Tulpamancy, because you have, say I'm an Otherkin and I identify as a wolf and a tree, and I really like this series that I've read, or a manga or whatever it might be, with this character that all has to do with androids and cyborgs and things. And I really, strongly identify with that as well, but I don't think of it as a part of my own identity. So there would be a distinction here in identifying as and identifying with.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, you can get into like, oh, well, you're splitting hairs, but for them, it's very important. So they identify as the wolf or whatever they would identify as, but then they have this affinity with something else. And then this idea of, well, then I want to have that also be with me. But then they create this character that's based off of a fiction, and that becomes a part of their headspace then. Or they can actually feel that they are that identity. This gets into kind of tricky waters for the Otherkin themselves, because they think, well, you can't have something that is created by someone else, a character that's created by someone else. That gets into very, very deep conversations about how this could even be possible, that you could identify as the creation that came out of somebody else's mind. But they make it work. They talk about it in ways, and they're saying, why couldn't it? And I'm not so skilled as to be able to explain all of the reasons why. But they think that, yeah, I think it can work. Other people might disagree, but for them, it's the real thing.
It sounds entirely plausible to me, because this is, again, we're dealing with these, whether they're fictional worlds, actual worlds, gaming worlds, it's this plurality of worlds that are all nested inside each other, and they all have a relation to each other. So it's not too great a step to make it work, certainly not within my understanding of the world, frankly.
Right.
Yeah, and again, at least what I see is being done in reality shifting is also a continuation of generally a wider trend within the spiritual milieu that can be traced back at least to the 1960s. And we have Carol Cusick here writing on the Church of All Worlds, which was established in 1962, I think, and inspired by the fictional novel Stranger in a Strange Land. And we have Tanya Luhrmann pointing out the importance of fictional literature for the self-identification of the English magicians in the 1980s. We have Wouter Hanegraaff, who talks about H.P. Lovecraft and chaos magic. So these connections and this inspiration of fictional literature is nothing new. But the shifters, they are also struggling with it, because we see in the popular media a lot of criticism of them wanting to go to Hogwarts. I think you talked about it already, Cavan, that this is seen as not good enough somehow. And then just because they are so young, they want to go to Hogwarts. But it's really nothing new. Personally,
I think this is a shame, right? What you were saying about people being derogatory about these kinds of things. Yep. So much of what we figure out about how to act in the world and how the world ought to be is in the laboratory of fictioning. And this idea that somehow these people are sort of, it's lesser than, right? Because maybe someone else's conceptualization of how the world can be, they think is more elegant or more important or more ethical, or sure, I understand that point. But I also think within these kind of practices, what I'm really interested in about these ones that we're looking at that are blooming and are popular is their relationship with play. And that can't be taken apart as unimportant, because like magic, play, children, imagination, right back to Tulpanmancy and its relationship with imaginary friendship.
Yeah.
These are important things to consider. And actually that kind of view of what they're doing is not important, it's not serious, they're just playing. Well, actually, this is very serious play. And I think that's another attempt to pull things apart that are inherently connected and interrelated.
Yeah. What would be your closing remark as to the bigger picture here? Or perhaps your takeaway?
I mean, I have a few thoughts. I think for how important these are, how impactful they are in these youth internet subcultures, and how little attention they're being given in research communities and by others is criminal, frankly. I think what's going on here has something, it's an emergent phenomenon. Obviously, it has a relationship with other practices, as has already been pointed out. But in its current form, it's really blossoming in a very powerful way. And I think this has something to do with these young people's way of trying to deal with the world that we're now entering, its incredible uncertainty, how fast it's shifting, the sense of post-truth, how more malleable reality seems to be than it ever has been before. And I really think that these young people, as well as playing, which they most certainly are, and why should they not? They are occultural researchers, and we need to be engaging with them because I think actually they're doing really important work, which might be extremely important to our future collaborative survival if we manage to make it through this period that we're going through. I genuinely see it as that important.
Yeah, I completely agree. And what for me is the most interesting is what can our disciplines, what can we learn from shifting, and what can maybe shifting learn from what we have done previously. And so with the perspective or the lens of, so I'm from religious studies, but also in the study of esotericism, there you can put it in this culture, in the spiritual milieu. You can see where it comes from and also why things change exactly. So where do these ideas come from? These explorative and playful ideas, do they come maybe from the Marvel universe? And they combine these older traditions with their new ideas and then creating something that is at the same time super embedded in the spiritual milieu, but also very unique. And I think that is such an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely that. And through these comparative studies, particularly, as you say, we can look at esotericism, the spiritual milieu, that has baggage within it because of its relation to religiosity. These phenomena just throw that away.
Yeah.
And yet we have so many of the similar processes, even similar aims, and the fact that we can kind of look at this without some of the other difficult conversations around credulity, religiosity, and many of the things that are attached to that, and that we have an opportunity to engage with what's going on within popular culture and everyday lived experience, and yet see these very important interrelationships and comparisons that should and are being drawn, as I say, ideally by more people. Then yeah, I think that would just be really valuable, again, as you say, both for their communities and for ours. Mm-hmm. And frankly, I found them being very open if they're being approached in the right way by academe. If there's not, obviously there's concerns about ethics with regards to that. We've already touched on that, and we don't want this to be an extractive process. As long as it's collaborative and participatory. For me, this is what all my research will be focused on in the coming years. And I see this will be a growing area of interest, a rapidly growing area of interest.
Totally agree with both of you on these points. And I would add my thoughts about, over the years as I've been researching what's going on here. And I think what we're dealing with also added on top of all of the, very interesting, wonderful things that you've shared, that we're talking about how we are moving through time and space, our consciousness, the nature of reality, how we are understanding our place in this larger context, the importance of the imagination, the importance of recognizing diversity, just more on a personal level, because oftentimes, I've had to kind of build a trust over a period of time, sometimes years, with people, and you kind of get to know people, and you realize these people are not doing this because they want attention or they're histrionic or something. There's nothing wrong with these people. They're people like you and me, and they just live their lives, and they have these ideas, and there's nothing that they're doing that is inherently wrong or bad. They're not hurting anyone. They just want to be accepted. And at the risk of just sounding super simplistic, I think this is what it's all about. It's about, let's be open to the possibilities that, that there are other things out there that we don't know anything about. I mean, the whole notion of consciousness, we don't even know what that is, really. So I think for me, it was a really eye-opening experience. And also, stop being so judgmental about people.
Yeah.
People are just, people are people. And it doesn't matter if they identify as human or not.
Also, towards the young researchers who do want to research these topics. And this is going to be like a little shout out because, as I already said, I also got quite some criticism. And then I have super amazing colleagues. Like the first person that I talked to was Karl Bayer in 2021, then Perez-van Rijn and Marcus Altena Davidson, but also people like Wouter Hanegraaf, Justine Bakker, and then you too, we have these people who really support such topics that, when some of these more established researchers, some of them say, this is just a trend and you shouldn't do that. And then, get your inspiration and your support from other group that will be supportive and that will see the relevance. And now, 4 years later, we are still talking about this topic. And I find it so amazing, Cavan, that you are picking this up because I think it's absolutely necessary. So we should be careful with the participants, how we speak to them, but also to the younger researchers who want to discuss such topics. That's just a little shout out.
No, that's a wonderful point to make, because this is, and to link to what you said, Stephanie, to go back to my core concern, which is my cultural studies grounding, is because what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with identity, we're dealing with power and agency. And we're dealing with, when we're talking not just to young researchers about what they ought to be interested in searching and what's appropriate to say or focus their attention on, and we're talking to other people about how they're choosing to engage in the world or what they're willing to do with their own kind of ideas about how they interrelate in the world or they imagine themselves or their being in the world. These are issues of power, and they're being told by hegemony, they're being told by a dominant culture, which is this is the control structures of the world, people telling people how to think and be in the world. These people are courageous and they're breaking out of those. They're having alternative epistemologies, alternative worldviews, alternative ways of even just how to think, how to be. And I think that's wonderful. And I think it's necessary. And I think we need to study it.
Totally agreed. Cavan, Sarah, thank you both for articulating so beautifully all of these ideas. I really appreciate this conversation. I'm glad that I'm finally making the jump into this on my platform. I've been kind of hesitant about it because it is a bit different from the other types of things that I talk about, but I do think this is important. And at the risk of coming across as, oh, this is crazy talk, this is weird, this is too weird. I am weird. I am fringe. That's what I do. That's who I am. So you like it or you don't like it, but I can't change it now. So
that's amazing.
Thank you again for being here. I really appreciate it.
Such a great talk with the two of you. I really enjoyed it. And I was so nervous, but it was
beautifully.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you're in good company. Right. We are the weirdos, mister.
That's right. Exactly. Okay. You guys take care. Thanks again.
All the best.
Thank you.